They did not all meet with success, but none failed as catastrophically as American attempts at nation-building in Vietnam. Vietnam and its neighbors in Southeast Asia were colonized by the French in the 19th century, until the beginning of World War II, when Japan invaded the region and seized control of Vietnam. When the war ended in 1945, France sought to reclaim its colony. They were opposed by a communist organization called the Viet Minh. Their leader was a Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh. Ho dreamed of uniting his country under one independent government. France fought the Viet Minh for 8 years in the First Indochina War before suffering a devastating defeat in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. French forces withdrew from Vietnam, while Ho's popularity spread throughout the country. But Vietnam became a pawn in the emerging Cold War. During ceasefire negotiations, the country was divided. Ho and his communist government would rule North Vietnam. A new Western-backed government was created in the South. American leaders feared that all of Vietnam would turn communist. They pushed aside the French and supported South Vietnamese Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem. Vietnam itself was not strategically important to the U.S., but American leaders feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in the region would follow. The tragedy that followed was epic in its scope and senselessness. Billions of dollars and more than 50,000 American lives were spent to stop the dominoes from falling. In the process, the United States laid waste to much of the country and killed more than 3 million people. In the 1970s, the United States endured a crisis of self-confidence that came to be known as the Vietnam Syndrome. Americans lost faith in their government. Political leaders lost faith in their military. The country questioned its role in foreign affairs. No one had any taste for another Vietnam.
I supported the war in Vietnam until I got out of high school and I was preparing to go to college, and I started to realize that there were so many young people from my generation who were protesting against the war. So I started to question, why would they protest? And then I started talking to my friends who were soldiers that went to Vietnam. They came home, and I started to realize the war was a terrible mistake. It was unjustifiable, it was immoral, and I knew that I had to join the protest. was a very active protester. I had already been an anti-war protester since the autumn of 1968 when I first went to college. And I joined a group called the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. They were a very strong, radical, anti-war organization, and they greatly influenced me to become more aware about the wrongfulness of the war in Vietnam. And I started to go to protests during 1968-69, and then by 1970, after I already knew several of my friends who were killed or injured in Vietnam as soldiers, on April 13th, 1970, one of my close childhood friends, a guy named William Caldwell, was killed in Vietnam. He was 19 years old. He was from my hometown, which is only about 13 miles away from Kent. So when he came home dead for the funeral, I went to his funeral service with my roommates and friends at college. And one of those was his brother. Bill Caldwell's brother, George, was one of our roommates in Kent. So we were very angry about the death of this soldier, and the funeral was on April 24th, 1970. Then only 6 days later, that's when Nixon, our president, announced he was expanding the war from Vietnam into Cambodia. So we knew that we were going to be joining those protests because we were so angry about attending that funeral, especially. And so on May 1st through 4th, I was a very active protester throughout the weekend, including the protests on Friday night, May 1st, in downtown Kent, where some windows were broken. Saturday night, May 2nd, on the campus at Kent State University, where a military science building, ROTC, was attacked and set on fire and burned down. And then on Sunday, May 3rd, I didn't do very much. I stayed home, basically. And then May 4th, I came out there to protest. I made a couple of black protest flags. I walked up to the rally, and then I was one of the main protesters waving a black protest flag, which symbolized my sadness and my anger about my friend's death in Vietnam and the war. And finally, after the National Guard attacked us with tear gas, they chased us. They started shooting into the crowd based on an order to fire, and I got shot through my right wrist. I would say it was just the increase in the number of troops. President Johnson took over, in 1963 after President Kennedy was assassinated. And President Kennedy was not increasing the troop levels in Vietnam. And as soon as he was assassinated, unfortunately, the new President Johnson started to really increase the numbers of American troops going to Vietnam. And that was around 1964 and 65. And I think when people saw how big the war was becoming and that it wasn't being won quickly and that there was great resistance from the Vietnamese people, that's when the American people started to really question the morality of the war, and they started to protest 1964, 65. I think the protest started right around 1965 in a big way. There was a protest in 1965 down in Washington, D.C., and that kind of launched the national anti-war movement. In 1967, there was another big march on the Pentagon, and there were many tens of thousands of people there protesting. And then in 1968, after the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, there was the Democratic Convention in Chicago, where the Democratic Party had their presidential nominating convention. There were thousands of students outside in the streets in Chicago being beaten and bloodied by the police. campuses really started to rise up in turmoil during 1969 and 70, to the point where after the Kent State shootings, there was a national student strike with over 4 million students protesting and over 800 colleges and universities shut down during that strike. So 1970 was a big turning point, and after that, not long after, the U.S. government had to stop the military draft, and they had to start bringing the troops home. Well, there were already significant protests happening earlier, that's for sure. But Nixon's announcement was so shocking because he had been promising to bring more troops home. When he first became president in January of '69, he said he was going to end the war in Vietnam. And here it was over a year later, and in fact he was expanding the war from Vietnam into another country, Cambodia. President Nixon said it was not an invasion, but the young people especially disagreed, and we all knew it was an invasion of Cambodia. So that was, I think it was the shocking nature of the invasion of Cambodia, the suddenness of it, and the fact that Nixon was promising to bring the troops home. It was a betrayal, and people just felt provoked. Students were blocking highways. They were burning buildings from coast to coast. They were having peaceful sit-ins. They were doing a lot of things. Well, I think the significance of the protest, especially in May of 1970, the National Student Strike, which was caused by the Kent State shootings, there were just so many students protesting at all of the major universities. And these were the sons and daughters of not only the working class people like us at Kent State, but also the sons and daughters of the members of Congress were protesting. I mean, it was a tidal wave of protest. And people descended on Washington. They surrounded the White House on May the 9th, 1970. And it was just like a huge crisis. And the government had to respond in some ways. You can see that the Congress soon thereafter started to cut off the funds for the war in Vietnam. They soon lowered the voting age from 21 down to 18. That was significant because in 1970, when we protested, you had to be 21 years old to vote, but you could go to Vietnam when you were 18. So that just wasn't fair, and they finally changed the voting age. They stopped the military draft, where young men were taken away from their families and their jobs and sent off to the war. So they just did a whole lot of things, and it was just a significant turning point because it was a tidal wave of protest. I think it did, yes, rapidly. That was very much a turning point. Many history books have noted that the Kent State tragedy and the anti-war movement, the National Student Strike, was a turning point in public opinion. Public opinion finally shifted against the war, like a majority of people in America said they were against the war. And that's when, politicians start to pay attention. When they're promoting an unpopular policy or war or anything, if the tide of public opinion turns against the politician, then likely they will change the policy. And that's what happened with the war in Vietnam.
Yeah.
In other words, they fought the war in Vietnam as long as they could get away with it by tricking people and fooling people and deceiving them into thinking that the war was proper. Well, that finally ended after the Kent State shootings and the National Student Strike in May of 1970. changed the course of the war for better because it helped to stop the war, stop the killing, stop the bloodshed, and bring peace to the beautiful country and the beautiful people of Vietnam. Well, I think the big change came in August of 1974 when President Nixon was forced to resign. You can see a quotation there by a guy named H.R. Haldeman. He was one of Nixon's top people in the White House, and he said that after the Kent State shootings, that's when Nixon started his downhill slide toward Watergate, which led to his resignation. Nixon started to spy on everybody, and he got real paranoid, and he tried all kinds of illegal activities to oppose his opposition among the student movement, the anti-war movement, and the news media and others, and it ultimately brought him down. So that was the big turning point, I think, when the protests forced out President Nixon. Then we had a new president come in, and they certainly did not promote the war in Vietnam any longer. The war came to an end. I think so, yes. And that's why I regret that our protests were not stronger sooner. You know, if you look at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., there's over 58,000 names there of our young people who were killed in Vietnam, and about a dozen of them were from my hometown. And if you look at the number of Asian victims, the Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians, and mostly the Vietnamese, over 3 million victims. I think this was one of the greatest tragedies in world history, and I regret that we did not protest stronger sooner. We should have not been so hesitant to protest in this country.